My name is Matthew Vredis. Stephanie Yap and I run a pottery studio named Ghostwares. Our studio is located within the Abbotsford Convent precinct, and I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Thank you for joining me on this Craft Contemporary Makers in Residence. This is Gus, he will be joining us as well. The majority of our time in the studio goes towards making our ongoing range. When we get the opportunity, we enjoy testing ideas and creating new work. Aggregate was a project of ours that looked at assembling objects to create a larger landscape. A part of this project was exploring uses for these objects once they had finished their life in the exhibition. For Tempest, we created 100 marbled mugs. When we viewed the images of these mugs in sequence, we began to see how the swirls and variations between them gave these mugs a sense of movement. Stop motion is something that we've been exploring in a very playful way. For this project, we're hoping to use stop motion as something that will inform the actual design of our work. The goal for this residency is to create some jewellery holders that, when viewed in sequence, act as frames in an animation. Whilst you won't be hearing much from Steph during this residency, she's been a really big part of it and I'd like to thank her. The form of these jewellery holders will be based on the motion of rippling water. To start off, I'm going to record some water droplets. After realizing that water does not show up very well on this camera, I'm going to substitute for milk. After playing the recording back in slow motion, we have a sense of what the forms will be, so I'm going to start off by mixing some clay. Instead of making sample chips, because I do want to try out a couple of different colors, I'm actually going to throw some small jewelry holder tests. For this, I'm going to use Walker Ceramics No. 10 stoneware clay, along with a grey stain and a chrome green stain. I struggle a bit with throwing small objects, but these are coming together relatively well. There's no specific way in which I am approaching this, I'm just trying to move the clay around until I get a form that seems appropriate. Whilst the test pieces are drying, I'm going to have another look at the design for our jewellery holders. Tracing frames from the droplet video will help inform the flow of our animation and hopefully make it seem a bit more natural. In designing these jewellery holders, I wanted to try and make sure that they do remain functional, so it's about balancing how to create a convincing animation and a set of objects that can be used afterwards. Once these have dried a bit, we're going to quickly trim them and then try and get them into the kiln as soon as possible. I forgot my drill at home, so I'm going to be messy and pour the glaze back and forth between buckets to mix it. Glazing these is a little bit fiddly and I'm making a little bit of a mess of it. In hindsight, using a brush on glaze would probably have been better. I'm cleaning off all the excess glaze from the edges of the vessels. Soon we'll be able to put them in the kiln and see how they turn out once fired. Here are some before and after shots in the kiln. You can see everything is shrunk and the colour has come through. In initial testing, it looks like they do work as jewellery holders. I've done a bit of work updating our design drawings. I've added dimensions for each piece and tried to calculate how much clay we'll need. Now I'm going to start wedging clay for our final pieces. So again, we're using Walker Ceramics number 10 stoneware, and we're using the grey stain at 2%. Wedging can be a pretty good exercise. I mainly use the ram's head method, but I do a bit of spiral wedging sometimes. Once the clay is wedged, I'm going to measure out the amount that we need for each piece, and each is going to have its own specific label so that I can keep track of where they sit within the sequence. Throwing these takes quite a bit of time, mainly because I don't have experience throwing some of these forms. One of the trickiest things I find is that if you push clay too far to the outside, it's difficult to bring back in. So there's a little bit of back and forth of slowly trying to figure out where the clay wants to be. Once I get going, it gets a bit easier to throw these. Each piece is quite similar to the one before it, so you start to establish a bit of a rhythm. For this project I've decided to make 30 jewellery holders. It's a good amount to be able to establish a loop and hopefully a good video. So this is an opportunity for us to test whether our animation will work or not. I've taken the last frame of each piece and played it in sequence. I probably let the jewellery holders sit for too long on the bats. They've dried a little bit too much and are stuck. I nearly lose a couple in the process of trying to remove them. The uneven drying might also cause cracks. These are quite small objects, so I'm hoping that we'll be able to avoid that. These are the tools we'll be using to trim the jewellery holders. You'll notice there's a rotary stamp. We're going to use this to number each piece so that we can keep track of where it stays in the animation. Once we're set up for trimming, there's one little tool I want to make. It's basically a foam riser for my existing foam bat. This will allow us to trim some of the more awkward shapes. I'm using a Giffen grip to trim our first jewellery holder. Trimming the first piece is relatively straightforward, it just requires a bit of patience and fiddling. Unfortunately, I stomped on the pedal of the pottery wheel and I'm going to have to remake this one. So this jewellery holder doesn't fit in my existing foam bat, so we're going to use our new riser that we made. After looking at this vessel again, I think the ridges are a bit too shallow, so we're going to try and trim them down a bit more so each ridge is a bit more defined. I'm going to finish up with trimming for today and pack everything up. Once these are dry, we'll get them in the kiln for the bisque firing. I remembered to bring my drill today, so I'm going to mix up some glaze and then we'll sieve it to make sure there's no rough particles in it. So I mentioned that I should probably use a brush on glaze for this. I am not. I'm just going to try fiddle with it and make a big mess. Once all of these are glazed, I'll clean them up and we'll get them into the kiln. Unloading the kiln, it looks like so far everything has worked out. The colour of these is quite subtle, but should hopefully work well as a backdrop to jewellery. Once the kiln is unloaded, I can arrange the pieces in sequence and we can begin setting up for our animation. For this stop motion, we'll be using a neutral backdrop and an artificial light. Whilst there are simpler ways to create a stop motion, I'll be using all the tools that I have available. I will be tethering my camera to a laptop so that I can view each frame as it is captured. I will also be using a piece of software called Dragon Frame. This is handy as it lets me play the video as I take each individual frame. And here we have an animation. So from here, I think it would be good to test out the jewelry holders in a few different scenarios. And the other thing I'd like to try is testing out whether we can make some more stop motions. I'd also like to try a time-lapse video. The light isn't good today, there's a lot of clouds, so it's going to be flickery, but hopefully it can give a sense of time passing. For the rest of the day, I don't think you need to hear my voice, so if you made it this far, thank you so much.